Alright, so the video lesson itself. So this lesson is divided into really two components, I would say. One component is the PowerPoint, and the other component is what I'm going to use to explain what's going on. I'll probably switch back and forth, and when I'm not using the PowerPoint, up in the top right corner, bottom left corner, somewhere I'm going to put little slide images so you can see what the appropriate slide is for whatever I'm talking about. So one of the very first things you'll see on the document is I'm asking you to compare the nervous system and endocrine system. At this moment, the nervous system won't make a lot of sense because I haven't explained it to you. You're going to be working through the PowerPoint. And the PowerPoint, in most cases, because we are doing reduced learning, I'm not going to elaborate too much on it because the PowerPoint does have a lot of the bare bones information. Okay, so good enough to get by. Now, as we start the endocrine system, the first thing you want to know is what is the endocrine system? What composes the endocrine system? The endocrine system is made up of several different, well, basically every single gland inside the body that releases hormones into the blood supply is a part of the endocrine system. Unlike the circulatory system or the digestive system or the respiratory system, it's not continuous. We have the mouth that goes to the pharynx, that goes to the esophagus, and so on. With the endocrine system, we have glands all over the body. So the endocrine system is also responsible for many different functions. The endocrine glands, what they do is they release hormones. These hormones are able to have wide-ranging effects all over the body. As long as the target gland, or target tissue, or target cell has a receptor for the hormone will affect it. So it doesn't matter if the hormone's released by the brain or if it's released by the stomach. As long as some other part that's distant has a receptor for it, it will be impacted. Okay? The endocrine system should not be confused with the exocrine glands. Exocrine glands are glands we talked about in grade 11. So the salivary glands, the pancreas, that all connect to the digestive system by a tube or a duct, those are exocrine glands. Endocrine glands are ductless. They do not have a tube. They just release it directly into the blood supply. So when we take a look at something like this, this would represent the endocrine gland here. Right? We'd see the endocrine gland in this area. And this here represents the blood supply. So the endocrine cells release their hormones into the blood supply, and they go from the brain to the toe, and over here is the target cells with the receptors, and then they are affected by that. Now, this particular unit is a little confusing. All biology is really, honestly, quite a bit of it's confusing. But the reason why this one is a bit more challenging, when I teach it, I often use the word hormone for any chemical that has an effect in some other place in the body. But there are many chemicals that are messengers that do something very similar to hormones, but they're not technically hormones. So hormones are released by endocrine cells, and they have an effect on target tissue. There's these things called neurohormones, which are very similar to hormones, except they're released by neurons or nervous tissue. I will refer to them as neurohormones when I teach it, but after that I'll probably just call them hormones. Neurotransmitters are very specific. These are the chemical messengers of the nervous system, and they allow one neuron to communicate with another neuron. In some cases, you have the same chemical that can act as a hormone in one instance and a neurotransmitter in another. When you guys are doing your druggy presentation, many of you are dealing with drugs that act like neurotransmitters and occasionally act like hormones. Paracrine and autocrine, they deal with particular messengers that have very specific effects. So autocrine, as you can see here, these are secreted by cells in a specific area, your skin, and they have influence on the same cell type. And paracrine, they are released in a particular area into this tissue space, and they affect all other types of tissue. I'm not going to refer to autocrine or paracrine, but they're good terms to know. If we were in class, I would talk about prostaglandins, and I would talk more about histamines very specifically in the immune system, but I don't know how much we'll get into that with this particular learning. Pheromones are also interesting. This is where one animal releases a hormone-like substance that goes out into the environment and causes another animal, same sex or different sex, to behave differently based on those chemicals. So we see these pheromones all the time when mammals, certain mammals, are in heat, where the female releases a chemical, lets the male know that she's receptive, and spring is in the air, and so on, right? There's also other types of pheromones, and we'll talk about some of those in this lesson, as a matter of fact. So, you're responsible for knowing the hormones. You're responsible for knowing the various glands inside the body, and you're responsible for knowing what those glands produce and where those hormones go. There's a lot of information happening here. And in terms of the language of the hormone, there's quite a few different types. These hormones include tropic hormones. Tropic hormones are hormones released by one endocrine gland that affect another endocrine gland, and they cause that other endocrine gland to release another hormone. So it's kind of like a controlling hormone, if you like. When we look at our hormones, they come in two major types of varieties. We have peptide hormones, protein-based, and steroid hormones. How are they differentiated? Well, your peptide hormones, they bond to the cytoplasmic receptor, so they're floating around in the blood supply. They bind to a receptor on the cytoplasmic membrane, the plasma membrane. That complex will then cause a signal transduction pathway to be initiated. It's a whole series of biochemical reactions, and at the end of those biochemical reactions, you end up with an alteration of the cell activity, which might make the plasma membrane more porous, and might make it produce a secondary product. There's many things that can occur. These peptide hormones tend to work very quickly because of how they bind. You also need very small amounts. So you just need tiny amounts of this, and that will cause a major change in the cell activity. The other type of hormone is your steroid hormone. Your steroid hormones are also released into the blood supply, but instead of binding to the cytoplasmic receptor, they infiltrate the plasma membrane, and they bind. Instead of binding to a plasma receptor, they infiltrate the cell and they bind to a cytoplasmic receptor. This cytoplasmic receptor with the hormone is then activated, and it will migrate across the nuclear membrane to the DNA. During molecular genetics, we talked about something called a transcription factor. So these transcription factors, some of them are these steroid cytoplasmic receptor combos. So this signals the DNA to express a particular protein. So imagine you're going through puberty at a certain stage of your life, and a steroid hormone, testosterone and estrogen, they bind to cytoplasmic receptors, and they cause your cells to now start expressing new proteins, and you see these major changes in your body. So the next step is the expression of the protein, and then the protein product is excreted and does whatever it does. So these are two major classes of hormones. You should be familiar with both steroid and peptide. Steroid hormones are typically slower, as you can imagine. That whole process takes a while. Peptide hormones are typically fast. But when I say fast, this is relative. They're still quite slow compared to the nervous system. So that brings us to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is the major part of our endocrine system. And what happens here, let's see if I can fit this on here. Unfortunately, the smart notebook thing's in the way. But the hypothalamus is an extension of the brain. The brain is made up of nervous tissue, and the hypothalamus is nervous tissue. The hypothalamus controls the pituitary, and I'll explain in just a moment what the pituitary does. The hypothalamus also creates two very specific hormones. These hormones include oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. So all the other hormones we talk about are going to be produced by the endocrine system. Because those two hormones I just mentioned are produced by the hypothalamus, which is the brain and nervous tissue, they're technically neurohormones. So when the hypothalamus produces this, they go to a particular part of the pituitary called the posterior. I'll get to that in a moment. Okay? So your hypothalamus is the major homeostatic control center of the body. This is where you find your osmoreceptors. This is where you find your the thermoreceptors. This is where you find many of the receptors that determine that your body is going to react because it's too cold, or you're dehydrated, or you don't have enough salt, or you have too much sugar, or whatever it happens to be. Your hypothalamus is responsible for that. So because I've talked about those two hormones, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, or also known as vasopressin, I'm going to explain how one of those works. So this is an excellent time for me to go into and complete osmoregulation. So for the osmoregulation, instead of drawing it out like I often do, I'm going to use this diagram, and hopefully you can follow along with the diagram and what's happening here. So you require a certain level of osmolarity in your blood. If your osmolarity goes too low or too high, that means that there's something you're out of balance. The homeostasis is not set. So typically the homeostatic set point in your body for osmolarity is about 300 microosmoles. And that's the value. So if this number goes too low or too high, then your body needs to make an adjustment. So let's say you're dehydrated, right? If you're dehydrated, what happens is these osmoreceptors that are in your hypothalamus, they will shrink. So they might have been this size, and they'll shrink. And when they shrink, that sends a trigger to release the antidiuretic hormone. This antidiuretic hormone is stored in the pituitary, the anterior pituitary. The antidiuretic hormone will then be released into the blood supply, and it will go all throughout the blood. But the only place where you have receptors for antidiuretic hormone is on the nephron. And we talked about the nephron last week. The nephron will have receptors for antidiuretic hormone. The antidiuretic hormone causes the nephron to reabsorb more water. So more water is absorbed because of the antidiuretic hormone. As you reabsorb more water, what that does is it will lower your osmolarity. Your osmolarity will come back to the set point where you want it. Once that osmolarity is back to 300, that will send a negative feedback to the hypothalamus saying we don't need any more water reabsorbed, and then those special cells will be the right size and it will turn off the release of ADH. So that's called negative feedback, where the set point is able to be reached and negatively inhibit the entire process. The hypothalamus also will do a behavioral change where it will go to the cerebral cortex, we'll talk about that later, and you'll become thirsty and you'll drink more water in order to increase your water level. Okay? So a combination of the antidiuretic hormone and behavioral responses will change your blood osmolarity back to the set point. That's ADH, antidiuretic hormone. In addition to antidiuretic hormone, we also have other hormones that are responsible for the balance of water inside your body. And these other water regulation hormones systems include the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. And this one is quite complex. As a matter of fact, I'm not going to talk about it now. I'm going to put a star beside this, and I'm going to do another little, I know that's a star, right? Let's see what I do about a star. And I'm going to come back to this in another mini lesson and explain how RAS works. It is a good system to know, but in our distance learning with all the information that you have to do, this might not be the best time for me to teach it to you. Okay? So I'll come back to this later. So the ADH and the RAS system and the atrial natriuretic factor, which is released by the heart. So this is released by the heart. This is released by the kidney, mostly. These two plus the ADH all regulate water balance. And there's actually a fourth one as well, which is the epinephrine. And you might have heard of that. It's also known as adrenaline. Okay, and that's released by the adrenal gland. So all these here are part of the water regulation system. So when you're thirsty or your water volume goes down, one of these systems goes into play. The major system, the one that you should be familiar with for osmoregulation, is the ADH, antidiuretic hormone. Okay. So that gives you a basic understanding of osmoregulation. That lesson is now mostly complete, and you can go back to that flow chart and you should be able to complete that and make some sense of it. So that means I can now go over to the pituitary gland, right? So let's go back to the pituitary gland. So I had that open already, and the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland is controlled by the hypothalamus. And the pituitary gland is responsible for producing the majority of the hormones that control your body. Okay? The pituitary gland is known as the master gland, and it is the functional control of the endocrine system. However, the pituitary gland is controlled by the hypothalamus, which is part of the brain, so the hypothalamus is the osmoregulatory center, if that makes sense. Your pituitary gland is embryologically made up of two types of tissue. The green tissue here represents nervous tissue, and this yellow tissue, amber, orange, whatever color you want to call it, is endocrine tissue. Endocrine tissue, if you ever look at it in the fetal pig where we saw it last year, it's very distinctive. So this here is anterior pituitary is actually endocrine tissue, and the green here is nervous tissue. So the pituitary, even though it's very small and tiny, it's made up of two parts. A nervous part that holds the ADH and the oxytocin, which I haven't explained yet, and the anterior pituitary, which holds the rest of them. So what is over here in the anterior pituitary? There's quite a few things. We have the thyroid stimulating hormone, we have the adrenocorticotropic hormone, growth hormone, the gonadotropic hormones of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, prolactin, and melanocyte stimulating hormone, and endorphins. So all these here are produced by the anterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary holds oxytocin and ADH, which are produced in the hypothalamus. Right? So I'm not going to explain every single one of these. I have that collaborative document, which I encourage you guys to work through, and you'll get a better understanding. Some of you will learn it as you do your druggy presentation, because your drugs affect very specific or imitate very specific hormones or neurotransmitters, which we've not got to yet. I want to finish off this section here by talking about oxytocin. Oxytocin is a very special hormone. Oxytocin is released, one of the places released is during childbirth. So during childbirth, the goal is to get the baby out of the mom. And so typically if everything's correctly situated, then the baby's head will be on the cervix. And when the baby's head's on the cervix and ready to be born, then the head will push the cervix, and that will send a signal to the brain through a nervous transmission. I'm going to use green here. So a nervous impulse is going to go to the brain, and the brain's going to be like, oh, there's a baby ready to be born. Let's release oxytocin. So then the brain's going to release this oxytocin. Remember, the hypothalamus release it into the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland, the posterior pituitary release the oxytocin into the blood supply, and it will go everywhere in the body, but it's in the uterus where the receptors are for this particular hormone. And so the hormone oxytocin will bind to these receptors and will cause the muscles of the uterine wall to contract. And when it contracts, it pushes the head against the cervix. And that in turn will send a bigger message, a bigger signal to the brain, and the brain's like, release more oxytocin, so it releases more oxytocin. And then that will cause the uterine wall to push, and the head will go even further in the cervix, which will send an even bigger message to the brain, and you get the picture, right? And so on, and so on, and so on. And eventually, there's so much pushing happening that the mom is able to push the baby out, and the baby's born. So this example I've just talked about here, this is one of the few examples of positive feedback that you'll see inside the homeostatic lesson. So this is the opposite of homeostasis. Homeostasis is typically at a set point and you want to achieve it. If you go high or below it, then you come back to it. But in positive feedback, you'll notice you have a set point and you keep on going away from it. Right? And so positive feedback is still important in overall maintenance of the body, but it's not really homeostasis. It's the kind of the opposite as you push towards the extreme big, the extreme small, or something. So this is a classic example of positive feedback. And this is oxytocin, which is one of the neurohormones released by the hypothalamus into the posterior pituitary, where it's held until it's ready to be used. So I'm going to end this particular point here, and the next point I'm going to talk about the specific examples of the anterior pituitary for negative feedback and antagonism and reproduction.